The Texas sun hung like a brass coin in the white August sky of 1944. Heat shimmered off the scrubland, turning the horizon into a liquid mirage. Dust devils spun across the open range where cattle once grazed. Before the war took the young men and left only the old, the wounded, and the waiting. Tom Walker stood at the edge of his property, squinting at the wooden structures that had appeared 3 months ago. Camp Mesquite, they called it. A prisoner of war facility for 30 German women pulled from the Atlantic after their hospital ship went down off the Carolina coast. The barbed wire looked wrong against the endless Texas plain, like a scar on weathered leather. Tom was 62, with hands that remembered the trenches of the Argonne Forest and eyes that had seen too much smoke. His ranch had shrunk to 15 acres and 3 horses. The war had taken his son to the Pacific. Letters came irregularly, each one a small mercy. Inside the camp, Ingrid Muller sat in the shade of the mess hall, her nurse's training making her automatically check the faces of the other women for signs of heat exhaustion. Her fingers moved through the motions of rolling bandages from strips of old sheets, though there were no wounded here to tend. Just waiting. Just surviving. She was 34 but felt ancient. Her husband, Klaus, had been posted to the Russian front in 1942. No word since Stalingrad. The hospital ship had been her escape from the bombed ruins of Hamburg, a chance to serve somewhere the walls weren't collapsing. Then came the torpedo, the cold water, the American destroyer that fished them out like drowning kittens. The other women rarely spoke anymore. They moved through the routines like ghosts, grateful for shade and water but hollow behind the eyes. At night, some cried quietly, others stared at the Texas stars, so different from the stars over Europe, and wondered if anyone they loved still looked at the same sky. The guards were young, barely 20. They treated the German women with awkward courtesy, uncertain how to reconcile orders with the sight of exhausted women in threadbare dresses. The camp commander, Lieutenant Harris, was a former schoolteacher from San Antonio who ran the facility by the book but without cruelty. Tom had watched the camp from a distance, wrestling with memories that wouldn't settle. In 1918, a German soldier named Ernst had pulled him from a shell crater, carried him to an aid station, then disappeared into the chaos. Tom never learned his name until after the armistice, never got to say thank you. The debt had sat in his chest for 26 years. A stone he couldn't swallow. The afternoon air smelled of creosote and dust. Somewhere, a hawk called. Inside the camp, Ingrid finished her bandages and walked to the fence, looking out at the vast emptiness. Freedom and imprisonment looked the same in Texas, both stretching to a horizon you could never reach. The county supervisor arrived at Tom's ranch on a Thursday morning, his Ford truck rattling up the dirt road. Frank Morrison was 50, thick around the middle, with a bureaucrat's careful manner and a rancher's practical streak. "Tom, need to talk to you about something unusual." They sat on the porch while Frank explained. The War Department had new directives about prisoner treatment, something about the Geneva Conventions and demonstrating American values. The local camps were supposed to provide occasional meals that went beyond basic rations, to show that America treated prisoners humanely. "They want you to cook for them?" Tom kept his voice neutral. "You and your crew. The county will provide supplies." Lieutenant Harris requested someone who knows real Texas cooking, not Army mess hall slop. Frank pulled out a requisition form. "Pork, beef if you can get it. Whatever fixings you need. They're asking for a proper meal." Tom looked out at the land. His ranch hands, Carl and Jimmy, were down to working 3 days a week since the herd had been sold. Both were 4F, Carl because of a childhood injury that left him with a limp, Jimmy because of partial deafness from scarlet fever. "Folks in town gonna have opinions about this," Tom said. Frank nodded. "Already do. Betty Parsons at the general store said she wouldn't sell meat to feed Nazis. Had to explain these women aren't Nazis, just Germans. Most were nurses or ship crew. Didn't matter to Betty." When? Saturday evening. Lieutenant Harris thought cooler evening would be better than midday heat. Tom was quiet for a long moment. The hawk circled overhead, riding thermals. "I'll do it, but I'm cooking what I know. Real Texas barbecue. None of this army ration nonsense." Frank smiled with relief. Figured you'd see it right. You're a good man, Tom. After Frank left, Tom sat on the porch as the sun climbed higher. Carl came around from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. Heard most of that. You sure about this, boss? Had a German soldier save my life once. Never got to return the favor. These ain't the same Germans. No. But kindness don't have a nationality. Carl considered this, then nodded. Jimmy's gonna have questions. Jimmy can ask them. That evening, Tom drove into town for supplies. The general store was closed, as expected. He went to the butcher instead, old Raymond Cole, who'd lost a leg at Bellow Wood. Need pork and beef for Saturday, Tom said. County's paying, Raymond knew. Small towns had no secrets. For the camp, yes. The old butcher wrapped the meat in paper, his movements efficient despite the prosthetic leg. My grandson's in France right now, fighting their people. I know. Raymond tied the package with string. But I also know you don't let people go hungry when you got the means to feed them. That's what separates us from them. Tom paid, grateful for understanding he hadn't expected. Saturday morning, Tom and his crew loaded the truck with supplies. Cast iron grates, mesquite wood for smoking, 3 ice chests of meat, sacks of potatoes, corn, flour for cornbread. Carl had scrounged a battered radio that still caught the country music station from Abilene. The camp sat behind double fences topped with wire, guard towers at each corner, though they were rarely manned with more than one soldier. The main gate opened after Lieutenant Harris verified their authorization. Inside, the camp was spare but organized. 4 barracks buildings, a mess hall, latrines, a small administrative office. Clotheslines strung between buildings held dresses and undergarments, drying in the perpetual wind. A few women sat in the shade, mending clothes, or simply staring into space. Lieutenant Harris met them by the mess hall. He was thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a careful way of speaking. Appreciate you doing this, Tom. The women have been through hell. German hell, Atlantic hell, and now Texas summer hell. Where you want us to set up? East side of the mess hall. There's an area with some trees, little bit of shade. I'll have the guards bring out tables. Tom surveyed the location. It would work. Carl and Jimmy started unloading, while Tom built the fire pit, arranging rocks and setting up the grates. The work was familiar, centering. He'd cooked for ranch hands and neighbors, for church gatherings and funerals. This was just another meal, but it wasn't. The women watched from a distance, curiosity breaking through apathy. Ingrid stood near the fence of the exercise yard, arms crossed, studying the preparations. She recognized the ritual of it, the careful arrangement of fire and iron. Food was being prepared with intention, not just served from cans and pots. One of the younger women, Elsa, joined her. She was 23, blonde, with a nervous energy that hadn't been dulled by captivity. What are they doing? Cooking, Ingrid said in German. Really cooking. For us? I don't know. Lieutenant Harris approached the women's area, speaking slowly in English. A few understood. Ingrid understood. Her father had been a professor, insisted his children learn languages, English, French, some Russian, useful skills in a world that kept tearing itself apart. Ladies, Harris said, tonight you're invited to dinner. Real dinner. These men are preparing traditional Texas food. It's a gesture of hospitality. Murmurs spread through the group. Suspicion, hope, confusion. Ingrid translated for those who didn't understand. They're making us a meal, Texas style, he says. Why? Elsa asked. Ingrid had no answer. The afternoon sun crawled across the sky while Tom worked. He rubbed the pork shoulders with salt, pepper, garlic powder, paprika, a touch of cayenne. The beef brisket got similar treatment. Then both went onto the grates over low mesquite smoke. The wood popped and hissed, releasing its sweet, sharp fragrance. Carl started the cornbread, mixing meal with buttermilk and eggs in a large bowl. Jimmy wrapped potatoes in foil and nestled them in the coals. The radio played Hank Williams and Bob Wills, steel guitar floating across the compound. Inside the barracks, the women prepared themselves with whatever dignity captivity allowed. Ingrid washed her face and hands, smoothed her dress, tied back her dark hair with a strip of cloth. Others did the same, a ritual of self-respect in a place designed to strip it away. Margaret, who'd been a telegraph operator before the war, sat on her bunk crying quietly. I can't do this. I can't sit with them and eat and pretend. Ingrid sat beside her. We're not pretending anything. We're accepting food. That's all. My brother died at Kasserine Pass, and my husband is probably dead in Russia. We all have our ghosts, Margaret. But we're still alive, and they're offering us a meal. We can honor our dead by surviving. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, but Margaret nodded and wiped her eyes. The meat had been smoking for 3 hours when Tom checked it with his knife. The pork pulled apart in tender strands. The beef had formed a dark crust that gave way to pink, juicy interior. Perfect. Carl had made 3 pans of cornbread, golden and cracked on top. The potatoes were soft, ready for butter and salt. Jimmy had improvised a sauce from ketchup, vinegar, brown sugar, and spices, simmering it in a pot until it thickened and glazed. The smell was extraordinary. Smoke, meat, sweetness, the complex layers of wood fire and rendered fat. It hung in the air like a presence, undeniable and almost aggressive in its appeal. Even the guards noticed. A young private named Danny approached Tom cautiously. Sir, that smells better than anything I've had since basic training. Tom smiled. Good barbecue is half smell. Gets in your head before it hits your tongue. My dad used to smoke brisket back in Oklahoma. Nothing like this, though. Every man develops his own style. This is mine. While the meat rested, wrapped in foil to keep warm, Tom thought about the last time he'd cooked like this. His son Ben's 16th birthday, 1939, before the world caught fire again. They'd had neighbors over, people laughing. His wife Sarah, still alive and teasing him about hogging the grill. That life felt like something he'd dreamed. The memory of his German savior returned, as it often did. Ernst. He'd learned later. Ernst Becker. From a village near Leipzig. He'd survived the war, Tom discovered through Red Cross channels in 1920. But they'd never corresponded. What would they have said? Thank you for not letting me bleed out in no man's land? Sorry my country killed millions of yours? Now here was Tom. 26 years later, in another war, cooking for German women, who probably knew men who'd killed American boys. The circularity of it made him tired. Carl interrupted his thoughts. Boss, meat's ready. You want to start setting up plates? Tom nodded. Let's make it proper. Plates, not trays. Utensils, not fingers. These ladies are gonna eat like people, not prisoners. They arranged everything on the tables the guards had brought out. Platters of sliced brisket and pulled pork. Bowls of cornbread chunks, the potatoes split open and steaming. A pot of beans Carl had made with bacon and molasses. Pitchers of cold water with lemon slices. Even some wild sunflowers Jimmy had picked, stuck in an old tin can for decoration. Lieutenant Harris surveyed the spread with approval. You've outdone yourself, Tom. This looks like a church social. Food's meant to be shared, especially good food. The sun was lowering now, the heat losing its edge. The light turned golden, softening the harsh lines of the camp. Carl adjusted the radio, finding a station, playing gospel music. The sound drifted across the compound, incongruously peaceful. Tom washed his hands in a bucket, dried them on his jeans, and looked at the meal he'd prepared. Whatever happened next, he'd done his part. The rest was up to something bigger than any of them. Lieutenant Harris walked to the barracks where the women waited. 30 faces looked up at him with varying degrees of wariness and hope. He'd learned a few words of German during his months as camp commander, but mostly relied on Ingrid to translate. Ladies, he began, then waited while Ingrid repeated in German. Tonight, you're invited to eat with us. Not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as guests. These men have prepared a meal in the tradition of Texas hospitality. We would be honored if you would join us. The women looked at each other, uncertain. This broke every assumption they'd built about their captivity. Meals were delivered in the mess hall, eaten in silence, cleaned up quickly. This invitation suggested something else, something their experience hadn't prepared them for. Ingrid stood. "We accept," she said in English, then in German. "We go, we eat. We show them we have not forgotten how to be civilized." The walk from the barracks to the dining area was only 50 yards, but it felt longer. The women moved in a group, protective of each other, unsure of what awaited. Then they saw the tables, the food, the flowers, and several stopped walking entirely. Elsa whispered in German, "This is real?" "Looks real," another woman, Greta, answered. Tom stood near the grill, watching them approach. He saw their thinness, the way their clothes hung loose, the exhaustion in their postures. But he also saw their dignity, the way they held themselves despite everything. These were not broken people. They were bent, certainly, but not broken. "Welcome, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "Hope y'all are hungry." Ingrid translated, her voice catching slightly. Several women nodded. "Please," Tom gestured to the tables. "Sit anywhere you like. Food's hot and ready." The women moved slowly, taking seats with the careful movements of people who'd learned not to trust good fortune. Guards stood at a distance, not threatening, just present. Lieutenant Harris sat at one end of the longest table, Tom at the other. For a moment, no one moved. The two groups faced each other across plates and platters, Americans and Germans, captors and captives, separated by language and war but connected by this strange moment of suspended hostility. Then Tom stood, picked up the serving tongs, and began loading his plate with brisket. Carl followed suit. Jimmy did the same. The simple act of eating gave permission. Ingrid reached for the pork, placing a modest piece on her plate. Then cornbread. Then a potato. Her hands trembled slightly. Around her, other women did the same, filling plates with an almost reverent care. The first bite was always a revelation after months of bland rations. Ingrid cut into the pork, brought it to her mouth, chewed. The smoke flavor hit first, then the tenderness, the fat rendering into silk on her tongue, the hint of spice and sweetness. She closed her eyes. Around the table, similar reactions. Women tasting food that had been prepared with skill and care, not just efficiency. Food that carried flavor and intention. Elsa bit into cornbread and made a small sound of surprise. The texture, the slight sweetness, the way it crumbled, all of it unexpected and wonderful. Greta, older, gray-haired, ate slowly, methodically, tears running down her weathered face without acknowledgement. The meal unfolded in near silence at first, broken only by the scrape of utensils and the occasional word passed between neighbors. The radio played softly, Patsy Montana singing about the cowboy sweetheart. The sun dropped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tom ate without hurry, watching the women without staring. He'd spent enough time around hungry people to recognize the signs. They ate carefully, not wanting to seem greedy, but their plates emptied quickly and eyes lingered on the platters. "Please," he said, gesturing to the food. "There's plenty. Don't be shy," Ingrid translated. Several women hesitated, then reached for seconds. The tension in their shoulders eased incrementally. This was real. They could trust it, at least for tonight. Carl refilled water pitchers. Jimmy brought out more cornbread, fresh from the oven. The guards, who'd been given permission to eat as well, filled their own plates and sat slightly apart. Young men who probably felt as strange about this evening as the prisoners did. Margaret, who'd been crying in the barracks earlier, ate with focused intensity. Each bite seemed to anchor her to the present moment, pulling her away from whatever memories haunted her. She looked up once, caught Tom's eye, and nodded slightly. He nodded back. The food kept coming. Tom sliced more brisket, the knife parting the meat like it was made of smoke. The outer bark crunched slightly. The inside melted. He'd been smoking meat since he was 15 years old. learning from his grandfather who'd learned from his grandfather. This was knowledge passed down, refined, perfected. To share it with anyone, even former enemies, felt right in a way he couldn't articulate. As the meal progressed, small conversations began. Halting, uncertain, but present. A guard named Tommy asked Ingrid, through gesture and simple English, where she was from. Hamburg, she said. Big city. Port. He nodded. I'm from Corpus Christi. Also port. She smiled slightly. Water everywhere, yes? Yes, ma'am. Another woman, Anna, who'd been a teacher before the war, spoke to Carl in broken English. This food, very good. Thank you. Carl, surprised and touched, replied. You're welcome. Glad you like it. The simple exchanges built small bridges across the divide. Not friendship. Not yet. Maybe never. But recognition. Acknowledgement that everyone at these tables was human, was hungry, was far from home. Elsa ate 3 pieces of cornbread, savoring each one. The texture reminded her of something her grandmother made, a sweet bread with fruit. Not the same, but close enough to trigger memory. She closed her eyes and was briefly 8 years old again, in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and butter. Before any of this happened, Tom watched the emotions play across the women's faces and felt the weight of history pressing down on the evening. His son was fighting in the Pacific against Japanese soldiers who were probably eating rice and fish while thinking of their own homes. Somewhere in Europe, American boys were eating K-rations in foxholes while German soldiers ate whatever they could scrounge. The insanity of it all, the massive machinery of war, reduced here to a simple meal in the Texas evening. It started with the cornbread. Greta, who'd been eating in focused silence, took a bite of the sweet, crumbling bread and suddenly her composure shattered. She set down her fork and wept, shoulders shaking. One hand pressed to her mouth as if trying to hold back a sound too large to contain. Ingrid reached for her, but Greta waved her off. Not rudely, just needing space for her grief. She spoke in German, words tumbling out between sobs. It tastes like my mother's kitchen. Like Sunday mornings before church. She made bread like this, sweet and warm, and we'd eat it with butter and honey. I can't remember the last time I felt like someone cared enough to make food that tasted like love. Around the table, other women's eyes filled. The dam had broken. Not everyone cried, but everyone felt the pressure of withheld emotions suddenly released. They'd been strong for so long, surviving through will and numbness, and this simple act of kindness had breached their defenses. Elsa cried into her hands, shoulders heaving. Margaret stared at her plate, tears rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto the pork she'd just cut. Anna pressed her napkin to her eyes, trying to maintain dignity, even as her body betrayed her. The Americans didn't know what to do. The guards looked uncomfortable. Lieutenant Harris shifted in his seat, clearly moved but uncertain of protocol. There was no army regulation for this. Tom set down his fork and spoke quietly, not sure if anyone understood but needing to say it anyway. I know y'all are far from home. I know this war has taken things from you that you'll never get back. I don't pretend to understand what you've been through, but I do know that tonight, for a few hours, you're not prisoners and we're not guards. We're just people sharing a meal, and that's worth something. Ingrid translated through her own tears, her voice thick. When she finished, several women nodded. One, a woman named Helena, who'd barely spoken since arriving at the camp, looked directly at Tom and said in careful English, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing us." Tom's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The meal continued. But something had shifted. The crying gradually subsided, replaced by a different kind of silence. Not the tense, watchful silence of the beginning, but something softer, exhaustion maybe, relief. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed. Carl brought out the last of the cornbread and set it on the table. Just baked, he said softly. Still warm. Women reached for it with less hesitation now. They'd earned this food through their survival, through their willingness to accept this strange grace. They ate it with gratitude that needed no translation. The sky deepened to purple, then indigo. Stars began appearing, the same stars that shone over Europe and the Pacific, over trenches and ships and cities being bombed to rubble. Here, in this small camp in Texas, people sat under those stars and ate barbecue and tried to remember what peace felt like. Jimmy, who'd been quiet all evening, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Ingrid?" He'd learned her name from Lieutenant Harris. "Would you tell the ladies that Mr. Tom fought in the First War, in France? A German soldier saved his life." Ingrid looked at Tom with surprise. He nodded slightly, gave Jimmy a look that said it's okay. She translated. The women looked at Tom with new eyes, understanding suddenly why this man had cooked for them with such care. He was paying forward a debt 26 years old, trying to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. One of the older women, Frida, spoke in German. Ingrid translated. She says her father also fought in that war. She says maybe the man who saved you was her father. Tom smiled sadly. "Maybe so. We'll never know. But I like to think that somewhere, sometime, every kindness gets repaid." As the dinner wound down, plates emptied and eating slowed to occasional bites, the conversations became more substantial. Ingrid found herself talking with Tom, with Lieutenant Harris translating the more complex exchanges. "Why did you do this?" she asked. "Really?" Tom considered his answer. "I've been thinking about that all week. Part of it is the debt I mentioned. Part of it is that I got tired of seeing enemies everywhere. You're just women. Tired, scared women a long way from home. Same as my neighbors would be if the situations were reversed. But we are the enemy. Technically. But technique and truth ain't always the same thing. The truth is, you didn't start this war any more than my son did. You're just caught in it. Same as the rest of us." Ingrid was quiet for a moment. "In Hamburg, before I left, I watched the city burn. British bombs. American bombs. They didn't care who was Nazi and who wasn't. Just burned everyone the same. My neighbor, Frau Weber, she hated Hitler. Hated everything he stood for. But she burned the same as the true believers. War's not precise," Tom said. "That's its great sin. It's a sledgehammer when what we need is a scalpel. Your son, where is he?" "Pacific. Last letter said he was on a supply ship. Relatively safe," he claimed. "I don't believe him. My husband was at Stalingrad. I believe he's dead, but I don't know." The not knowing is its own kind of death. They sat with that shared grief. Two people on opposite sides of a global catastrophe, united by the specific pain of loving someone in danger. Lieutenant Harris, who'd been listening, spoke up. "My brother's a pilot. Flies bombers over Germany. Every night I wonder if he's dropping bombs on someone like you, Miss Mueller. Someone who's just trying to survive." "Probably he is," Ingrid said without judgment. "And probably someone is shooting at him. This is what we've made of the world. But not tonight," Tom said firmly. "Tonight ain't no war. Just people eating together. That's all we got. And it's enough." Around them, other small conversations were happening. Carl was showing Elsa pictures of his ranch horses, pointing and saying the names while she repeated them, practicing pronunciation. Jimmy had drawn a map of Texas in the dust and was showing Anna where they were, where the cities were, using simple words and gestures. The guards and prisoners weren't friends, but they'd become something else. Witnesses to each other's humanity. That was the best that could be hoped for under the circumstances. One of the younger women, Clara, approached Tom shyly. She held out a piece of cornbread she'd saved. "For later?" she asked in English. Tom wrapped it in a napkin for her. "Course. Take as much as you like." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from any of them. It transformed her face, made her look like the young woman she was, instead of the exhausted prisoner she'd become. As full darkness settled, the temperature dropped to something almost comfortable. The mesquite smoke had thinned to wisps, the coals glowing orange in the fire pit. Moths circled the electric lights that had been strung up. The radio played on, songs about lonesome trains and dusty trails. The mythology of the American West rendered in steel guitar and nasal harmony. Greta, who'd wept over the cornbread, approached Tom with careful dignity. "I want to say, in English so you understand directly, tonight you gave us more than food. You gave us the memory of being treated like people. That will sustain us longer than the meal." Tom stood, faced her. "Ma'am, I only did what seemed right. You'd do the same in my place." "I hope so. I hope I would be that brave. Ain't about bravery. It's about not letting the war make you into something you're not." She nodded, pressed his hand briefly, and returned to her table. Lieutenant Harris started organizing the cleanup. The women helped without being asked, clearing plates and scraping leftovers. They worked alongside Carl and Jimmy, a temporary unity of purpose. The guards watched, weapons present but not prominent, young men who'd tell this story for the rest of their lives. Tom packed up his equipment slowly, not wanting to break the spell. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality, an impossible interlude in the hard reality of 1944. Tomorrow, the war would resume. The women would return to their routines, the guards to their duties, and the world would keep tearing itself apart. But tonight it happened. It was real, and that couldn't be taken back. Sunday morning broke with unusual clouds, a weather front pushing in from the west. The sky was gray and low, promising rain that might not come but changing the light into something softer, more forgiving. Tom didn't go to the camp. He'd said what he needed to say with the meal. Words after that would just dilute the meaning. But Monday morning, Lieutenant Harris drove out to the ranch. He looked tired, older than his 35 years. He accepted coffee and sat on the porch with Tom while the morning heated up. "Got orders," Harris said, "transferring the women to a larger facility in Oklahoma. Better resources, they say. They're leaving Wednesday." Tom nodded, not surprised. Nothing stayed still during war. "Thought you'd want to know. Miss Mueller asked me to give you something." Harris pulled a folded piece of cloth from his pocket. "Said to tell you it's not much, but it's what she has." Tom unfolded the cloth. It was a handkerchief, white cotton worn soft from many washings. In one corner, someone had embroidered in simple blue thread, "Danke. Thank you." He ran his thumb over the stitching. Careful work done with a needle and thread, scrounged from somewhere. Hours of labor for this small gesture. She'd do this herself? Worked on it all day Sunday. Said she needed to mark what happened. Make it real. Tom folded the handkerchief carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Tell her I'll keep it. Tell her I hope she finds her husband, or at least finds peace with not knowing." "I will." Harris finished his coffee. "You know, I teach history. Or I did, before all this. I keep thinking about what I'll tell students someday about this war. The big battles, sure, the turning points. But also, this. A barbecue in a prison camp. Enemies breaking bread. Seems important, somehow. Maybe it is. Maybe kindness is the only thing that survives a war. Maybe." Wednesday came with the rain the clouds had promised. Not a downpour, just a steady drizzle that darkened the earth and settled the dust. Tom watched from his porch as the army trucks drove past on the distant road, heading north. He couldn't see the women. Couldn't know if Ingrid looked out the canvas back toward the ranch. But he felt the moment anyway, the severing of a brief connection. Carl joined him, 2 men standing in the rain. Think we'll ever know what happened to them? Probably not. War's got a way of swallowing people. The leftover meat's still in the ice house. Should I cook it up for us? Yeah. No sense wasting good food. They ate lunch in silence, the memory of Saturday night still fresh. The rain continued through the afternoon, soaking into the parched land, giving the ranchers and farmers something to talk about besides the war. 30 years is a long time. The world turns, people die, memories fade into the sepia tones of history. The war ended, as wars do, leaving rubble and trauma and changed borders. The men came home, or they didn't. The women picked up the pieces. Or they didn't. Tom's son Ben made it back from the Pacific in 1946, 22 years old and carrying the Pacific in his eyes. He took over the ranch, married a girl from San Antonio, gave Tom grandchildren who ran through the fields where prisoners once lived behind wire. The camp was dismantled in 1946. The wood sold for salvage. The land returned to grazing. By 1950, you could barely tell it had been there. Only the older folks remembered, and they mostly didn't talk about it. Tom was 88 when the letter arrived in 1974. The handwriting was shaky but careful, the envelope covered in German stamps. His granddaughter brought it to him on the porch where he spent most of his time now, watching the land and waiting. Dear Mr. Walker, you will not remember me. I am one of the German women you cooked for in the summer of 1944 at the camp in Texas. My name is Ingrid Muller, though it is Ingrid Schmidt now. I have thought of that evening many times over the years. It took me 3 decades to find your address through various organizations and much persistence. I hope this letter finds you well, and that you remember that night with some of the warmth I do. I wanted you to know what became of some of us. After the war, I returned to Germany to find Hamburg in ruins, and my husband listed among the missing at Stalingrad. I remarried in 1949, a good man named Peter, who understood grief. We have 3 children, 7 grandchildren. I worked as a nurse until last year, when I retired. Several of the women from the camp stayed in touch. Elsa lives in Munich and teaches languages. Greta passed away in 1968, but before she died, she spoke often of the cowboy who made bread that tasted like her mother's. Marguerite emigrated to Canada after the war and raises horses. She says they remind her of Texas, though the landscape is very different. I am writing to tell you that the meal you prepared was more than food. It was proof that human decency survives even in the darkest times. When I am tempted to despair about the state of the world, I remember that evening. I remember that a man I never met, whose country was at war with mine, chose kindness over hate. I still have the handkerchief, the one I gave Lieutenant Harris to give to you. I kept it because I couldn't let go of that memory. But in writing this letter, I am finally letting go, or rather, letting it become what it always was. A moment of grace that changed how I saw the world. I hope you are well. I hope the war did not take too much from you. I hope you know that your small act of humanity rippled farther than you could have imagined. With gratitude and respect, Ingrid Schmidt, née Muller. Tom read the letter 3 times, each word settling into place. His eyes, clouded with age, filled with tears that spilled down weathered cheeks. He looked out at the land he'd worked his entire life, at the sky that had witnessed everything. His granddaughter, Lily, touched his shoulder. Grandpa, are you okay? He wiped his eyes, folded the letter carefully. Yeah, honey, I'm okay. Just remembering something from a long time ago. What is it? He told her then, the whole story. The camp, the women, the barbecue, the tears, the handkerchief still in his dresser drawer after all these years. Lily listened with the intense attention of the young, for whom history is story and story is magic. Did you ever write her back? Lily asked when he finished. Don't know if I could. Writing was never my strong suit. I could help. I'm good at writing. Tom considered this, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. They wrote the letter together that afternoon. Tom speaking while Lily's young hand transcribed his thoughts into careful cursive. He told Ingrid that he'd kept her handkerchief, that he'd thought of her and the others often, that her words meant more than she could know. He told her his son had come home safe, that the ranch still stood, that he'd lived a good life. He told her he was grateful she'd survived, that she'd found some peace, and he told her what he'd told the women that night, what he'd come to believe with the certainty of old age. Maybe kindness is the only thing that outlives a war. The letter was mailed the next day. Tom never knew if Ingrid received it. She'd been 80 when she wrote him, and the distance was vast. But that didn't matter. The circle had closed, or close enough. 2 months later, Tom died in his sleep, peacefully, the way people hope to go. At his funeral, Lily told the story of the barbecue, and the prisoners and the letter from Germany, The older folks nodded, remembering. The younger ones listened with wonder, trying to imagine their grandfather as a younger man, trying to imagine a world where such small acts of kindness could matter so much. The handkerchief was buried with him, tucked into his suit pocket, the blue thread of that single word still visible after 30 years. Danke. In the soil of Texas, that word and what it represented became part of the land, joining all the other stories the land held. Stories of cowboys and cattle drives, of drought and flood, of men who fought and women who endured, of enemies who ate together and cried together and remembered together. The war had ended long ago, but its echoes continued, reverberating through the lives it touched. Some echoes were destruction and trauma, the permanent scars of violence and loss, but others, quieter, were echoes of moments like that Saturday night in 1944, when the machinery of war paused long enough for people to be people again. Those echoes mattered too. Maybe they mattered most. The ranch still stands. Tom's great-grandchildren work it now, raising cattle and horses, fixing fences and digging wells. Sometimes, when the wind blows right, you can smell mesquite smoke from a neighbor's grill, carried across the fields. And if you listen very carefully, if you know the story, you might hear it still. The sound of people gathering, the clink of plates and forks, the low murmur of conversation between those who thought they were enemies and discovered they were not. You might hear the music playing softly. Country songs about loneliness and home, about the long, dusty roads we all travel, looking for places and people where we can rest for a while. You might hear the tears, the release of grief too long carried, the sound of walls coming down one brick at a time, and underneath it all, carried on the wind that never stops blowing across the Texas plain, you might hear the simplest truth. We are not so different, any of us. We hunger and fear. We hope and endure. We do our best with what we're given. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone cooks us a meal that tastes like home.